Patricia and Dennis handed Kelsey a $25,000 Tesla deposit. She screamed. Then Dennis slid a thin envelope to me, inside a $50 quitclaim deed for barren West Texas dirt and a note. Don't build a mansion. Remember the $5 tax? Everyone laughed. I slipped the paper into my coat. I am Maya. If you've ever been the punchline of your family's joke, drop your city and local time in the comments. You know exactly how this feels. The paper felt heavy. It was 7:15 on a Monday morning. The ambient noise of the special education classroom consisted of nothing more than the soft, rhythmic clicking of smooth wooden blocks. I sat on the padded floor mat, my posture relaxed, breathing in the scent of sterile wipes and lavender oil. This was my sanctuary. This was where the chaotic, glittering noise of Patricia and Dennis could not reach me. Sitting across from me was Leo. He was 7 years old, diagnosed with severe autism, and possessed a mind that worked in beautiful, complex patterns that most people never bothered to decipher. He was currently stacking blocks in a precise, colour-coded spiral. I did not interrupt him. I simply placed a yellow block near his knee, offering a silent piece to his puzzle. He took it without looking up, his small fingers brushing the back of my hand. In this room, patience was not just a virtue, it was the only currency that mattered. I had spent my entire life learning how to be quiet, how to observe the emotional weather of a room before taking a step. With my family, that silence was a survival mechanism. With Leo, it was a bridge. The classroom door creaked open, and Leo's mother, Sarah, stepped inside. The dark circles under her eyes seemed heavier today. Her nursing scrubs wrinkled from what I knew was her third consecutive double shift. She offered a fragile, apologetic smile. She worked 3 separate jobs just to keep up with the specialised therapies Leo required. I stood up, dusting off my knees, and walked over to her. We spoke in hushed tones so as not to disrupt the delicate peace of the room. Her voice trembled as she admitted that the bank had sent a final notice of foreclosure. They were drowning. The medical bills had consumed everything, and the system designed to help them was moving too slowly. I looked back at Leo, who was completely absorbed in his structural masterpiece, blissfully unaware that the roof over his head was crumbling. A familiar ache settled in my chest. The world was brutally efficient at crushing the vulnerable. It rewarded the loud, the ruthless, and the superficial. It rewarded people like Kelsey. It punished people like Sarah. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, murmuring words of comfort that felt painfully inadequate against the cold reality of a bank mandate. I wished I could fix it. I wished I had the power to shield them from the grinding gears of a society that only valued profits. I returned to the mat, sitting beside my student as the morning sun filtered through the blinds. I watched his small hands. The deed in my coat pocket was not just a piece of paper, it was a ghost. It belonged to my late grandfather, Arthur. He was a man carved from the harsh, unforgiving landscape of West Texas. He spent 40 years pulling copper and grit from the earth, ruining his lungs and callousing his hands to provide a life that Dennis ultimately deemed embarrassing. Dennis built his wealth in suburban real estate, wearing tailored suits and speaking with a refined cadence that explicitly erased his blue-collar roots. He despised the dirt under Arthur's nails. He despised the small, unglamorous life his father led. And when Arthur's lungs finally gave out, moving him into a sterile hospice room, Dennis practically erased him from memory. I was 26 at the time. While Patricia and Kelsey were posting heavily filtered photos from a luxury resort in Cabo, I was sitting in a dim room, smelling of antiseptic and impending grief. I fed Arthur ice chips. I read him chapters from old Western novels. I listened to the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of his oxygen machine. I was the only one who held his rough, weathered hand as his pulse slowed to a stop. Arthur's estate was meagre. A rusted pickup truck, a few savings bonds, and a seemingly worthless patch of rocky land in the middle of nowhere. Dennis as the executor, handled the meagre assets with vocal irritation. He complained endlessly about the administrative nuisance, especially regarding the land. It generated no income, held no aesthetic value, and required a $5 annual property tax. To Dennis, it was an insult, a lingering stain of poverty. I vividly remembered the afternoon in the lawyer's office. Dennis had tossed the file across the mahogany table with a sneer. He did not want his pristine financial portfolio polluted by barren dirt. He needed a dumping ground, and I was the convenient receptacle. He demanded I take the title, phrasing it not as a gift, but as a chore I owed the family for being the less busy daughter. I signed the papers without a word. I did not care about the monetary value. I cared that it was the last physical anchor to the only man in my bloodline who had ever looked at me with genuine pride. I paid the $5 tax every year, keeping the deed tucked away in a drawer. Dennis thought he was handing me a burden. He thought he was tossing his father's legacy into the trash. He used that very transaction, years later, to publicly humiliate me at a dinner table surrounded by crystal glasses and expensive wine. He believed he had won. He left it for me. 3 days had passed since the anniversary dinner. The humiliation of the $50 deed had faded into the familiar, dull throb of my daily existence. It was a Thursday afternoon, raining lightly against the windows of my modest apartment. I was grading individualised education plans at my kitchen counter, nursing a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea. I took a break to check the mail. Among the usual grocery circulars and utility bills was a thick, cream-coloured envelope. It had been forwarded multiple times, covered in yellow postal stickers. The return address belonged to a geological surveying firm based out of Midland, Texas. The recipient name printed on the front was Arthur's. My brow furrowed. Arthur had been dead for 8 years. I gently sliced the envelope open with a butter knife, pulling out a dense stack of documents printed on heavy cardstock. The first page was a topographical map, laced with intricate red and blue contour lines. Beneath the map was a grid of GPS coordinates. I walked over to my filing cabinet, retrieved the $50 quitclaim deed Dennis had mockingly handed me, and cross-referenced the numbers. They were identical. It was his land. My land. I flipped to the executive summary of the report. The jargon was dense, filled with terms like subterranean aquifers and mineral stratification, but the bolded heading on the third page required no geological degree to understand. It read, "Confirmation of Grade A core reserves." My heart executed a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I read the subsequent paragraphs 3 times, my eyes tracking the black ink until it blurred. The barren, rocky surface of that West Texas plot was nothing but a shell. Beneath it sat one of the purest, most concentrated deposits of lithium and rare earth minerals ever charted in the county, layered above a massive, pristine underground aquifer. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed the firm's findings into a specialised market valuation database. I accounted for the current global surge in electric vehicle manufacturing and the desperate corporate scramble for domestic lithium sources. I hit enter. The estimated extraction valuation populated on the screen. It was not a modest sum. It was not enough to merely buy a nicer car or pay off a student loan. It was $150 million. I sat back in my thrifted dining chair. The apartment was completely silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Patricia and Dennis had laughed. They had handed me the ultimate symbol of my worthlessness. They had legally, permanently severed their ties to the dirt to avoid a $5 tax. The joke was on them. People often ask why I did not react at the restaurant. Why did I not throw the wine in Dennis's face? Why did I not tear the deed into pieces and walk out? The answer lies in the quiet, insidious architecture of a toxic family. It is a psychological phenomenon, Clinical professionals call learned helplessness. When you are raised in an environment where your pain is constantly invalidated, you eventually stop screaming. You learn that reacting only provides your abusers with the ammunition to call you unstable. From the time I was a little girl, the family narrative was rigorously enforced. Kelsey was delicate, a rare flower that required constant financial and emotional sunlight. I was the sturdy weed. I could survive in the dark. I remembered high school. Kelsey received a brand new convertible and a custom prom dress that cost more than a semester of community college. I wore a second-hand dress and worked 3 shifts at a local diner to pay for my own textbooks. When I finally gathered the courage to ask Patricia for help with a tuition deposit, she sighed, looking at me as if I had deeply disappointed her. "Maya, you are so capable," she had said, patting my cheek with a cold hand. "Kelsey needs our help. She is sensitive. You have always been our independent rock. Do not be selfish." That was the trap. They weaponized my resilience. Every time I succeeded on my own, they used it as proof that they did not need to parent me. My strength became their permanent excuse for neglect. Over 34 years, the conditioning settled into my bones. I stopped asking. I stopped expecting. I built an entire adult life around the premise of needing absolutely nothing from them. So, when Dennis handed me that $50 joke, I smiled. I swallowed the sharp, burning humiliation and slipped the paper into my pocket, because reacting would have shattered the armour I had spent 3 decades building. If I cried, Kelsey would have called me dramatic. If I yelled, Brandon would have called me bitter. I had accepted the role of the silent, unbothered daughter, because fighting for my worth felt like a battle I had already lost before I was even born. I thought accepting the disrespect was a sign of maturity. I thought ignoring the wounds made me invulnerable. I did not realise that by tolerating their casual cruelty, I was handing them the right to define my existence. Strength became my invisible cage. It was 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. I drove my aging sedan out of the Austin city limits, navigating the winding roads toward a fading, working-class neighbourhood. I parked in front of a modest, weather-beaten bungalow surrounded by overgrown bougainvillea. This was where Aunt Evelyn lived. Evelyn was Patricia's older sister, but they might as well have been born on different planets. Evelyn had rejected the family's obsession with status decades ago, choosing a quiet life as a librarian. For this crime of authenticity, she was systematically excised from the family inner circle. Yet, she was the only person who mailed me a handwritten card every birthday. She was my only refuge. She opened the door with a warm, genuine smile, her hands dusted with flour. We sat in her cosy, cluttered living room, drinking peppermint tea from chipped porcelain cups. The space felt like a warm embrace, a stark contrast to Patricia's sterile, minimalist mansion where leaving a coaster out was a punishable offence. I told Evelyn about the dinner. I told her about the $25,000 deposit for Kelsey and the $50 quitclaim deed for me. Her jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective anger that my own mother had never shown me. Then she stood up without a word. She walked to her hallway closet and retrieved a heavy, brass-hinged wooden box. She placed it on the coffee table between us. "Arthur gave this to me right before he went into hospice," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "He made me promise to hold on to it until Dennis officially signed that land over to you. He knew Dennis's ego. He knew Dennis would never bother to look beneath the surface of anything that did not shine." I unlatched the box. Inside was an older, slightly yellowed version of the geological report I had received in the mail. But beneath it was a handwritten letter on lined notepad paper. The handwriting was Arthur's shaky, rushed, but deeply deliberate. I read the words. Arthur had suspected the mineral deposits for years. He had commissioned a preliminary survey but deliberately buried the results. He explicitly structured his assets to ensure the land looked like a worthless, tax-draining burden on paper. He knew Dennis's greed would compel him to cast it off, and he knew Dennis would use it to mock me. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Arthur had weaponized his own son's arrogance. By manipulating Dennis into drafting a legally binding quitclaim deed to humiliate me, Arthur had ensured that my ownership would be absolute, uncontestable, and bulletproof. He planned it all perfectly. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I navigated my aging sedan through the dense traffic of downtown Austin. I parked outside a nondescript brick building that housed Hayes Geological Consulting. Dr. Robert Hayes was an independent surveyor and the father of a former special education student I had taught years ago. He was a man of science, inherently skeptical and deeply meticulous. He owed me a favour for helping his son navigate a particularly difficult transition year, but I was not there for charity. I needed absolute, undeniable facts. I sat in his leather guest chair and handed him the yellowed report from Aunt Evelyn's box, along with the newer envelope I had received in the mail. He spent 45 agonising minutes in complete silence. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the air conditioning unit and the clicking of his mouse as he cross-referenced the coordinates on his dual monitors. I watched his expression shift from polite professional curiosity to intense, focused disbelief. Finally, he removed his reading glasses and rubbed his temples. He explained the geology to me in slow, measured terms. West Texas was notoriously arid, yet Arthur's seemingly barren plot sat directly above a massive, pristine, underground aquifer. Water rights alone in that region were incredibly lucrative. But the true treasure was the mineral stratification layered just above the water table. The reports confirmed a Grade A core reserve of lithium. It was the exact type of high-density deposit currently causing a frenzy among major energy corporations and electric vehicle manufacturers. The global push for domestic battery production had turned that specific patch of rocky dirt into a geopolitical gold mine. My mouth felt entirely dry. I asked him for a conservative, market-based estimate. Doctor, Hayes leaned forward, looking me directly in the eyes. He stated that a full extraction buyout, combined with the aquifer water rights, would command a minimum of $150 million. The number hung in the air between us, heavy and absolute. 150 million? I did not gasp. I did not cry tears of overwhelming joy. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my entire nervous system. The $50 quitclaim deed Dennis had mockingly shoved across a steakhouse table was an instrument of immense, generation-altering wealth. The shift in power was immediate, yet completely internal. I thanked Dr. Hayes, securing his solemn promise of absolute professional discretion. I drove straight to a highly secure local bank and rented their largest safety deposit box. I placed the quitclaim deed, Arthur's handwritten letter, and the comprehensive geological reports inside the dark metal chamber. I turned the key, listening to the solid, satisfying click of the heavy locking mechanism. The power was officially secured away from prying eyes. I was no longer the tragic punchline of a cruel family joke. I was a woman holding the keys to an absolute empire. The lock clicked securely shut. The very next evening, my phone vibrated loudly on the kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed Kelsey's name. I rarely received calls from my younger sister unless she required a captive audience for her latest triumph, or a convenient scapegoat for a minor inconvenience. I answered the phone, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. She did not bother with a polite greeting. Kelsey launched immediately into a breathless, irritated monologue about her new electric vehicle. The $25,000 deposit Patricia and Dennis had gifted her was apparently insufficient. She explained that the custom white vegan leather interior and the advanced autopilot technology package had significantly inflated the final purchase price. She was short exactly $8,000. I continued washing my dinner plate, the warm water running over my hands as I listened to her complain about the tragic hardship of settling for standard black upholstery. Then, the inevitable pivot occurred. Her voice shifted into a sweet, coaxing register. She suggested that since I lived so simply and never spent money on lavish vacations or luxury goods, I surely had a substantial amount sitting in my teacher savings account. She framed it not as a demanding loan, but as a mandatory sisterly duty. I turned off the faucet. I told her, calmly and clearly, that I would not be giving her any money. The silence on the line was thick and immediate. Before Kelsey could unleash her temper, the phone was fumbled, and Dennis's voice boomed through the speaker. He had been listening on speakerphone the entire time. He deployed his usual authoritative pressure tactics. He reminded me that I was the older sister, that family members were supposed to support each other's dreams, and that my refusal was petty and vindictive. He argued that since they had graciously given me that piece of land, I owed them a massive financial favour in return. The absolute audacity of his logic was breathtaking. He was leveraging a $50 joke to extract $8,000 of my hard-earned public school salary. I did not raise my voice. I simply reiterated that my personal finances were strictly off-limits. I heard Patricia in the background, her voice shrill and piercing. She called me a selfish, bitter woman who could not stand to see her beautiful sister shine. I let their insults wash over me like rain against a window pane. Their words no longer possessed the power to cut my self-esteem. They were just meaningless noise. I politely wished them a good evening and ended the call. Placing the phone face down on the granite counter, my resolve hardened into impenetrable steel. They believed I existed solely to absorb their excess burdens and fund their manufactured emergencies. They felt entirely entitled to the meagre savings of a special education teacher. I could only imagine the horrific depths of their greed if they knew about the $150 million. They did not deserve a single penny. I would give them nothing. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the school's main administrative office hummed a steady, irritating note. It was Wednesday morning, and I was making photocopies of behavioural tracking sheets for my classroom. Through the glass partition separating the copy room from the front desk, I saw Sarah. Leo's mother was sitting in a plastic waiting chair, her face buried deeply in her hands. Her thin shoulders shook with silent, agonising sobs. A crumpled piece of official bank stationery lay on the floor beside her worn, inexpensive sneakers. The final notice of foreclosure had, unfortunately, arrived. I stopped the copy machine, the sudden silence amplifying the raw sound of her despair. I walked quietly out of the administrative suite and peered down the long, empty hallway. Leo was sitting on a wooden bench outside the principal's door, patiently waiting for his mother. He was clutching a small, faded plastic dinosaur tightly against his chest. His eyes, usually bright with hyper-focused curiosity, were wide and intensely fearful. He did not fully understand the complex financial ruin crashing down upon his family, but he profoundly felt his mother's absolute terror. Children always absorb the emotional atmospheric pressure of their parents. My chest tightened with a deep, physical ache. This was the brutal, unforgiving reality of the world. A devoted mother, working 3 strenuous jobs, was about to lose her home. While miles away, Kelsey was throwing a petulant tantrum over vegan leather car seats. The systemic injustice was nauseating. I walked over to Leo and sat down gently beside him on the cold wooden bench. I did not speak. I simply offered him a visual anchor, a calm presence in a terrifying moment. As I sat there, the abstract concept of $150 million crystallized into something tangible and sacred. The massive fortune sitting beneath the West Texas dirt was no longer just a tool for personal vindication against Patricia and Dennis. It was a literal lifeline. It was the absolute power to rewrite cruel destinies. I could pay off Sarah's entire mortgage with a fraction of a percent of that money, and I would never even notice it was missing from the balance sheet. I could build an entirely new educational facility tailored precisely to the unique needs of students like Leo. The money had the potential to create an impenetrable fortress of safety for those who were constantly overlooked and undervalued by society. My family had always used money as a weapon of control and a toxic measure of superiority. I was going to use it as an instrument of profound healing. Looking at Leo's terrified expression, I made a solemn, silent vow. I would protect the wealth with ruthless efficiency. I would not allow Dennis or Patricia to siphon a single drop of it to fund their vanity. The capital belonged to the future now. The true purpose was clear. I took a personal day on Friday. It was a rare occurrence that required me to meticulously prepare substitute lesson plans. But the task ahead demanded my complete, undivided focus. I drove to the financial district in downtown Austin, parking near a towering glass skyscraper that housed one of the most elite private law firms in the state. I had researched their impressive credentials late into the night. I did not need a friendly neighborhood attorney. I needed a corporate shark. I walked into the sprawling, marble-floored lobby wearing a simple tailored blazer and slacks. The receptionist looked at me with mild, practiced skepticism before directing me to the senior partner's corner office. Her name was Vivian Vance. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, analytical eyes and a quiet demeanor that commanded absolute authority. I sat across from her massive oak desk and slid the geological reports and the quitclaim deed toward her. I did not embellish the story with emotional grievances. I relayed the facts, the valuations, and the circumstances surrounding the Thanksgiving dinner with clinical precision. Vivian reviewed the documents in total silence. When she finally looked up, her initial skepticism had vanished, replaced by a deep, professional respect. She confirmed that the quitclaim deed was legally ironclad. Dennis had foolishly and permanently severed all ties to the property. I explained my immediate tactical objectives. I wanted to initiate contact with the premier energy conglomerate currently dominating the lithium market, but I absolutely refused to expose myself to the inevitable frenzy. I knew exactly how my family operated. If Patricia and Dennis caught even a faint whisper of this financial windfall, they would descend upon me like a pack of starving wolves. They would deploy every emotional manipulation tactic and legal harassment strategy available to claim the massive fortune they believed was inherently theirs by blood right. I could not allow that to happen. I needed an impenetrable legal shield before the first dollar moved. I instructed Vivian that the name Maya must never appear on any public registry, press release, or corporate transfer document. I required absolute airtight anonymity from the world and from my relatives. Vivian leaned back in her leather chair, a slow, appreciative smile forming on her lips. She told me that most people who stumbled into sudden wealth immediately destroyed themselves with the loud noise of their own ego. She commended my restraint and foresight. She promised to build a legal structure so complex and opaque that not even a highly motivated forensic accountant could trace the corporate funds back to a public school special education teacher. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously mapping out the precise architecture of my financial defense. The silent fortress was built. The following week was a masterclass in bureaucratic precision and strategic silence. Under Vivian's meticulous legal guidance, I began the complex process of establishing a blind trust. We chose the corporate designation very carefully, opting for something utterly forgettable and entirely disconnected from my personal identity. We named it Luminescence LC. It sounded exactly like a minor commercial lighting supply company, or an obscure corporate wellness brand. It was the perfect, boring camouflage for a quiet entity about to absorb a 9-figure corporate buyout. We met in a highly secure, soundproofed boardroom with a licensed notary public and a private wealth manager that Vivian had personally vetted for discretion. The essential documents were stacked high on the polished mahogany conference table, dense with impenetrable legal terminology. Vivian patiently explained the specific mechanics of the defensive structure. We were creating an irrevocable trust. The word irrevocable was the absolute crucial cornerstone of the entire financial operation. Once I signed the heavily audited papers and legally transferred the quitclaim deed into the holding company, the action could not be undone by anyone. The assets and future profits would permanently belong to Luminescence LLC. I would remain the sole hidden beneficiary, shielded entirely from public disclosure and family scrutiny. Texas privacy laws regarding trusts were famously robust, and Vivian knew how to elegantly exploit every single loophole to maintain my absolute anonymity. I picked up the heavy brass pen provided by the law firm. My hand did not shake. I thought about the long decades of subtle belittlement and open favoritism. I thought about Kelsey's casual entitled demands for my teaching savings, and Dennis's mocking laughter echoing across the steakhouse table. They had willingly handed me this monumental opportunity wrapped inside a cruel insult. I signed my name on the final designated line, feeling the smooth glide of the dark ink against the crisp, expensive paper. The notary firmly stamped the document, the heavy thud echoing definitively in the quiet room. It was done. The $50 joke was now legally locked behind a massive, impenetrable legal firewall. When the major energy conglomerate inevitably purchased the land and the exclusive mineral rights, the $150 million would flow directly into the corporate accounts of Luminescence LLC. Patricia, Dennis, Brandon, and Kelsey could hire a literal army of private investigators, and they would find absolutely nothing connecting me to the historic transaction. I had effectively erased myself from the financial equation, ensuring that the immense wealth remained entirely under my calm control. I shook Vivian's hand, feeling a profound sense of total security settle deep within my chest. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and stepped into the warm Austin afternoon. The bustling world looked exactly the same, but the fundamental foundation of my reality had completely shifted. The transaction was permanently sealed. The first major wire transfer from the energy conglomerate cleared the stringent banking protocols exactly 21 days after Vivian finalised the trust. I was sitting at my small kitchen table when the secure notification pinged on my encrypted laptop. I logged into the private portal Vivian had established, the screen loaded, and an 8-figure sum stared back at me in stark, unblinking digital ink. It was the initial payment for the mineral extraction rights, safely secured within the impenetrable accounts of Luminescence LLC. I stared at the staggering number for a very long time. Society conditioning tells us that sudden wealth should trigger an explosive, euphoric reaction. We are expected to scream, to immediately purchase luxury vehicles, or to dramatically resign from our jobs. I did none of those things. I simply closed the laptop, finished my lukewarm cup of coffee, and went to my bedroom to get dressed for work. I put on my familiar, slightly faded blue cardigan and my comfortable, sensible walking shoes. I drove my 10-year-old sedan through the morning Austin traffic, listening to the same classical radio station I always did. When I arrived at the special education centre, I greeted my colleagues with the same polite, quiet demeanour. Absolutely nothing about my external presentation had changed. The true luxury of profound wealth is the absolute freedom of choice. I chose to continue teaching because I deeply loved the children in my classroom. I walked into the room and immediately sat down next to Leo on the padded floor mats. He was attempting to build a complex, multi-tiered structure. but his fine motor skills were failing him this morning. Frustration was visibly mounting in his small shoulders. I gently guided his hand, helping him balance a red wooden block atop a fragile column. He let out a soft, contented sigh when the structure held, sitting there, providing quiet support to a vulnerable child. I felt a deep, resonant peace settle within my soul. The immense capital sitting in my blind trust did not define my humanity or my daily purpose. It merely served as an invisible, heavy armor against a world that constantly tried to diminish me. Patricia and Dennis spent their entire lives desperately projecting an image of extreme wealth, drowning in high-interest debt just to appear important to strangers. They required constant, noisy validation from everyone around them. I required absolutely nothing. I was officially one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire county, and I was spending my morning patiently wiping spilled apple juice off a low plastic table. The dichotomy was intensely satisfying. I knew that soon. The money would be deployed to fundamentally change Leo's life and protect Sarah from foreclosure. But for now, the secret remained entirely mine. It was a silent, beautiful weapon that kept my mind completely insulated from the toxic expectations of my relatives. They still viewed me as the pathetic, unremarkable daughter who accepted their $50 insults. I allowed them to happily exist within their comfortable, arrogant delusions. The wealth remained completely invisible. It was precisely 6 weeks after that infamous Thanksgiving dinner. The holiday season was fully underway, bringing with it a manufactured cheerfulness that I mostly ignored. I was sitting in the empty teacher's lounge during my designated lunch period, reviewing an individualized curriculum plan, when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the overarching family group chat. Brandon, my notoriously opportunistic brother-in-law, had forwarded a link to an article from the primary Austin Financial Business Journal. He was a real estate broker who obsessively tracked high-value transactions, hoping to eventually land a wealthy patron. The headline of the article was undeniably striking. Anonymous LLC secures historic $150 million buyout for West Texas mineral rights. My pulse maintained its steady, even rhythm. Vivian had explicitly warned me that a corporate transaction of this massive magnitude would inevitably trigger regional financial press coverage. The details in the article were highly sanitized, focusing heavily on the corporate energy implications and the staggering valuation of the lithium deposit. The entity was identified only as Luminescence LLC. My name, just as Vivian promised, was nowhere to be found. Brandon's accompanying text message was dripping with greedy enthusiasm. He wrote about the insane luck of the anonymous seller, speculating wildly about the commissions a competent wealth manager could generate from such an account. Kelsey chimed in immediately, typing rapidly about how unfair the universe was, complaining that someone out there possessed $150 million while she was actively struggling to afford upgraded rims for her new Tesla. Dennis entered the digital conversation shortly after. He pontificated about how these massive deals were always rigged by corporate insiders, bitterly asserting that ordinary hard-working people like him never stumbled into that kind of generational luck. Patricia added a series of sad emojis, echoing his profound resentment. I scrolled through their messages while carefully unwrapping a modest turkey sandwich. The sheer, concentrated irony of their complaints was practically vibrating off the small glass screen. They were actively mourning their lack of immense fortune, entirely oblivious to the fact that Dennis had physically held the deed to that exact fortune in his manicured hands. He had willfully and arrogantly signed it away, just to publicly humiliate me and avoid a trivial $5 annual tax burden. They were collectively staring directly at the blinding magnitude of my success, completely unable to recognize it, because their inherent prejudice blinded them. In their rigid, superficial worldview, someone as quiet, unassuming, and fundamentally ordinary as Maya could never be associated with a 9-figure corporate buyout. To them, I was just the background furniture of their grand, dramatic lives. Furniture did not negotiate with multinational energy conglomerates. I did not type a single character in response to their digital lamentations. I locked the screen of my phone, placing it face down on the laminate table. The impending collision between their arrogant assumptions and the unyielding truth was drawing rapidly closer. But I was in no rush to accelerate the timeline. I simply drank my coffee. The fragile illusion of my family's ignorance shattered precisely 2 days later. The unravelling was not initiated by a dramatic confession or a leaked corporate document, but by the mundane, bureaucratic machinery of public county records. Brandon, perpetually hungry for affluent leads, could not let the massive West Texas transaction go. He possessed the specialised access and the relentless greed necessary to dig deeper. It happened on a Wednesday evening. I was at home, organising Leo's progress reports, when my phone screen illuminated with a frantic sequence of incoming messages. The family group chat, which had been dormant since their earlier complaints, suddenly exploded with a chaotic frenzy of digital activity. Brandon had utilised his professional real estate databases to cross-reference the limited geographic data mentioned in the business article. He tracked the specific county parcel numbers and the regional zoning codes associated with the recent massive buyout. Then, the fatal connection was made. He realised that the highly lucrative coordinates precisely matched the barren, seemingly worthless plot of land Dennis had owned for years. Brandon's message was a block of aggressive capitalised text. Dennis, the land you transferred to Maya at Thanksgiving, I just ran the parcel ID against the county registry. It's the exact same lot. The digital silence that followed his revelation was profound and heavily pregnant with shock. I sat in my quiet apartment, visualising the synchronised panic occurring across 3 different households. I could picture Dennis's face draining of colour, Patricia dropping her expensive wine glass, and Kelsey staring at her phone in absolute horrified disbelief. They were frantically assembling the fragmented pieces of the puzzle. Dennis had mockingly handed me a quitclaim deed to avoid a $5 tax. Weeks later, an anonymous entity named Luminescence LLC sold the exact same mineral rights for $150 million. The mathematical conclusion was entirely inescapable, and it fundamentally violated every single principle of their established family hierarchy. The invisible, discarded daughter was sitting on an empire. The realisation must have felt like a violent physical blow to their collective ego. The very person they had spent 34 years underestimating, manipulating, and deliberately pricing at the absolute bottom of their twisted ledger had quietly secured the ultimate financial victory. I watched the typing indicator bubbles appear and disappear rapidly beneath Dennis and Patricia's names. They were panicked, confused, and scrambling to formulate a response to a reality that completely destroyed their narrative. The power dynamic, which had remained rigid and unquestioned since my early childhood, inverted violently in the span of 3 text messages. I did not intervene. I remained a silent, untouchable observer. The furniture had become royalty. The immediate aftermath of Brandon's discovery was not characterised by reflection or shame. It was characterised by an aggressive, overwhelming avalanche of manufactured affection. My phone, previously a quiet device, transformed into an incessantly vibrating beacon of their sudden, desperate desperation. I placed the phone on my kitchen counter and watched it light up. Dennis called first. I let it ring. Patricia called 30 seconds later. I let it ring. then Kelsey, then Brandon, then Dennis again. The incoming calls stacked up relentlessly, a digital manifestation of their sheer panic. They were clearly coordinating, passing the frantic realization between them, completely unable to reach the daughter they had actively ignored for decades. After an hour of continuous ringing, I finally unlocked the screen to survey the damage. There were exactly 79 missed calls. More importantly, there was a barrage of text messages that served as a horrifying testament to their absolute hypocrisy. Patricia wrote, "Maya, my sweet special girl, we just heard the most incredible news. I am literally crying tears of joy for you. Call your mother immediately. We love you so incredibly much." Dennis followed with, "Maya, we need to sit down and discuss a comprehensive wealth management strategy. This is family money, and we must protect it together. I have contacts. Call me the second you read this." Kelsey's message was a masterpiece of entitled delusion. "OMG, sister, I knew you were keeping a secret. You totally deserve this. We have to celebrate in Aspen. Family sticks together through everything. If you've ever experienced sudden amnesia from toxic people when you succeeded, drop a 100 in the comments." I sat at my table and read every single message with clinical detached precision, in 79 missed calls and dozens of frantic texts. There was not a single syllable resembling an apology. Not one of them wrote, "I am sorry for humiliating you." Not one of them acknowledged the cruel $50 joke or the decades of blatant favoritism. In their deeply flawed psychological framework, they had committed no sin. I had simply stumbled into an astronomical sum of money, and therefore, my inherent value had finally reached a threshold that required their immediate attention. The $150 million had magically erased 34 years of neglect, instantly transforming me from an irrelevant afterthought into their beloved, cherished priority. The cold realization settled deep in my bones. The $50 quitclaim deed had taught them absolutely nothing about respect or human decency. The massive fortune had only amplified their insatiable greed. They did not want to reconnect with Maya, the special education teacher. They wanted to aggressively merge their failing financial lives with Luminescence LLC. They viewed my wealth as a communal asset that they were fully entitled to manage, distribute, and consume. I did not reply to any of them. I turned the phone on silent and walked away. Greed erased their cruel memories. Because I completely ignored the 79 missed calls and the barrage of hypocritical text messages, the inevitable escalation occurred the following evening. Patricia and Dennis could not tolerate being denied access to a financial resource they believed they inherently controlled. If digital manipulation failed, they would resort to physical intimidation. It was shortly after 7 o'clock when the heavy, aggressive pounding started on my apartment door. I was sitting on my sofa, reviewing legal documents from Vivian. The knocking was not polite. It was the demanding, authoritative strike of someone who believed they owned the space. "Maya, open this door right now." Dennis's voice boomed through the thin wood, laced with a familiar, demanding edge. I did not move from the sofa. I placed my documents carefully on the coffee table and simply listened. The physical barrier of the locked door represented the newly established boundary they were desperately trying to breach. "Maya, darling, please." Patricia's voice followed, adopting a sickeningly sweet, coaxing tone. "We are your family. We just want to celebrate with you. You cannot shut your own mother out in the hallway." When the sweet manipulation yielded no response, the narrative rapidly shifted back to aggressive entitlement. Dennis began speaking loudly, clearly intending for me to hear every word of his twisted logic. "Listen to me, Maya," he ordered through the door. "That land has been in this family for generations. I only transferred the title to you as a temporary tax maneuver. It was a strategic family decision. That $150 million is legacy money. It belongs to the entire family." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his claim was breathtaking. A temporary tax maneuver. He was actively attempting to rewrite history while standing on a cheap apartment hallway carpet. Brandon's brokerage firm is experiencing a severe capital shortage, Dennis continued, his voice rising in frustration. And Kelsey needs a proper down payment for a secure home. We are a family. Maya, families protect their own. You cannot selfishly hoard corporate wealth while your sister and your brother-in-law struggle. I remain perfectly still, my breathing slow and even. The psychological dynamic was entirely transparent. They were deploying every weapon in their toxic arsenal: guilt, obligation, fabricated history, and emotional blackmail. They expected the old Maya, the quiet, compliant daughter who always absorbed their demands, to panic, open the door, and hand over the keys to the empire. I looked at the solid wood of the door. The aggressive pounding resumed, vibrating the hinges. They were terrified. They realized that the daughter they had priced at $50 held the absolute power to deny them everything they coveted. They demanded compliance. I did not open it. I stood in the center of my living room, listening to the heavy thud of Dennis's fists against my front door. The aggressive rhythm was accompanied by Patricia's shrill, manipulative pleas. They demanded access. They demanded compliance. They fundamentally believed that because we shared the same genetic sequence, my financial sovereignty was entirely negotiable. I walked slowly toward the entryway. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I did not touch the brass handle. I simply leaned close to the painted wood and spoke in a voice that was perfectly level, devoid of any anger or panic. "Dennis," I said, my tone cutting clearly through the thin barrier. "Stop hitting my door." The pounding ceased immediately. The sudden silence in the hallway was thick with expectation. I could almost hear them holding their breath, anticipating my surrender. "I am not opening this door," I continued, speaking with the clinical precision I usually reserved for writing behavioural evaluations. "But since you are insisting on discussing a corporate asset in a public hallway, we will discuss the law. Do you actually understand the legal mechanics of the document you pushed across the table at Thanksgiving?" "Maya, don't be ridiculous," Dennis scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "It was a family transfer to save on property taxes. I bought that land. It belongs to us." "You did not execute a temporary transfer," I corrected him calmly. "You executed a quitclaim deed. You voluntarily, legally, and permanently relinquished every single claim, right, and future interest you held in that specific geographic parcel. You did it in front of a licensed notary public. You did it to make a joke about a $5 tax bill." "I can contest that," Dennis snapped, the panic bleeding back into his authoritative facade. "Any judge will see it was a misunderstanding. A judge will see a properly filed, legally binding contract." I replied, "You cannot claim coercion or duress. You were the one who drafted the paperwork. You were the one who presented it. Furthermore, the asset no longer belongs to me directly. It is securely held within a blind, irrevocable trust." "Do you know what irrevocable means, Dennis?" "It means the transfer cannot be altered, amended, or cancelled under any circumstances, not by you, and not by any lawyer you attempt to hire." I outlined the absolute, unyielding reality of the legal system. The law did not care about his bruised ego or Brandon's failing brokerage firm. The law only recognised the ink on the certified paper. I explained that the $150 million was legally insulated behind a firewall he could never breach. "Go home, Dennis," I said quietly. "There is no family money." For a long, agonising minute, there was absolutely no sound from the other side of the door. The profound realisation of his own catastrophic arrogance had finally paralysed him. Then I heard the heavy, defeated sound of their footsteps retreating down the carpeted corridor. The hallway went completely silent. The temporary retreat of Patricia and Dennis did not signify the end of the conflict. It merely signalled a shift in their tactical approach. It was Christmas Eve, exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping a cup of hot green tea, when my phone screen lit up with a lengthy text message from Dennis. It was a formal, aggressively worded ultimatum. He stated that if I did not appear at the annual family Christmas gathering that night to discuss asset reallocation and family support, he would immediately retain a high-profile litigation firm. He threatened to file an injunction to freeze my personal bank accounts and publicly expose my identity to the Austin media, claiming I had manipulated a vulnerable elder. I read the text twice. The sheer desperation was palpable. He was attempting to use the threat of public scandal and legal harassment to force my submission. I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney. Vivian answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the holiday evening. I read Dennis's text message aloud to her. I did not ask her if I should be afraid. I asked her to confirm the structural integrity of our defences. Vivian actually chuckled softly. She assured me that his threats were legally baseless and entirely unenforceable. An injunction required substantial preliminary evidence of fraud, which he absolutely did not possess. Furthermore, Luminescence LLC was so deeply buried within corporate privacy layers that his hypothetical lawyers would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just trying to verify its existence. "You are completely bulletproof, Maya," Vivian stated with absolute certainty. "He is firing blank cartridges in the dark." I thanked her and ended the call. A profound, settling calm washed over my entire body. I had spent 34 years tiptoeing around their explosive tempers, constantly shrinking myself to avoid their cruel scrutiny. I was done hiding. I realised that ignoring them would only allow them to construct a false narrative where I was a cowardly, greedy thief. I needed to dismantle their illusions in front of the necessary witnesses. I needed to look them directly in the eyes and deliver the final receipt for every single emotional debt they had accumulated over my lifetime. If you are ready for the ultimate confrontation, drop a yes right now. I walked into my bedroom and selected a simple charcoal grey turtleneck sweater and dark trousers. I did not dress to impress them. I dressed for absolute comfort. I walked over to my secure filing cabinet and retrieved the original $50 quitclaim deed, placing it carefully inside a thin manila folder along with the handwritten note Dennis had given me. I walked out of my apartment, leaving the silence behind. I was ready to face the absolute epicenter of the family chaos. I took a deep, steadying breath in the cool evening air. I grabbed my car keys. The sprawling driveway of my parents' suburban Austin mansion was packed with expensive luxury vehicles. The exterior was aggressively illuminated with thousands of synchronized holiday lights, projecting an image of pristine, affluent perfection to the entire neighborhood. I parked my aging sedan at the very end of the street and walked the remaining distance. When I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door, the atmospheric shift was instantaneous and jarring. The massive living room was filled with aunts, uncles, and cousins holding crystal flutes of champagne. The moment I stepped into the foyer, the ambient chatter abruptly ceased. Every single head turned toward me, their eyes wide with a hyper-focused, predatory intensity. For my entire life, my arrival at family functions had gone entirely unnoticed. I was usually expected to immediately retreat to the kitchen to manage the catering or supervise the younger children. Tonight, I was treated like visiting royalty. Patricia rushed across the marble floor, her arms outstretched, wearing a smile so intensely bright it looked physically painful. "Maya, you came. We are so incredibly thrilled you are here," she gushed, attempting to pull me into a tight, performative embrace. I subtly stepped back, offering a polite but distant nod. Dennis materialized behind her, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder, projecting the image of a deeply proud patriarch. They ushered me into the centre of the living room. The physical arrangement of the room was incredibly telling. They had cleared the large, comfortable leather armchair by the fireplace, the seat traditionally reserved for Dennis, and aggressively gestured for me to sit there. Kelsey hurried over, her designer dress shimmering, holding a glass of expensive French wine. She offered it to me with a desperate, ingratiating smile. On the glass coffee table, directly in front of the armchair, Brandon had meticulously arranged 3 glossy presentation binders detailing commercial real estate investment opportunities. The staging was immaculate. They had orchestrated this entire environment to flatter my ego, hoping to soften my defences before launching their coordinated financial extraction. I surveyed the room, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. I saw Aunt Evelyn sitting quietly in the corner, offering me a subtle, supportive nod. I looked at the expectant faces of my aunts and cousins, all of whom had eagerly laughed at my expense just weeks prior. They were waiting for me to melt into their manufactured warmth. They expected me to weep with gratitude for finally being included in the inner circle. I politely declined Kelsey's wine. I did not glance at Brandon's desperate investment portfolios. I unbuttoned my coat and placed the thin manila folder squarely in the centre of the glass coffee table, right on top of Brandon's glossy brochures. I did not sit down. The room grew thick with a strained, uncomfortable silence as I remained standing. The calculated hospitality was beginning to curdle into nervous apprehension. Dennis, ever the dominant force, decided to seize the narrative control. He picked up his crystal glass and cleared his throat loudly, demanding the absolute attention of the extended family. "Everyone, please," Dennis announced, his voice vibrating with a theatrical, commanding warmth. "Tonight is a very special Christmas. We are here to celebrate the incredible blessings bestowed upon our family. We are here to celebrate Maya, and the beautiful truth that no matter what happens, blood is always thicker than water. Family protects family." Patricia beamed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk napkin. Several aunts murmured their solemn agreement. It was a flawless, sickening performance of unconditional love. I waited exactly 3 seconds after he finished speaking. Then I reached out and opened the thin manila folder I had placed on the glass table. "Thank you for the warm reception," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the quiet room. "It is a stark contrast to the last holiday we spent together in this exact configuration." Dennis's smile faltered slightly. Kelsey shifted her weight, the ice clinking nervously in her untouched wine glass. I picked up the documents from the folder. 6 weeks ago, at Thanksgiving, Patricia and Dennis gifted Kelsey a $25,000 deposit for a luxury vehicle. The room celebrated her worth. I held up the single sheet of paper for everyone to see. Then, Dennis handed me this, a quitclaim deed to a barren plot of dirt in West Texas, and he attached this specific note. I read the handwritten words slowly, ensuring precise articulation. "Don't build a mansion. Remember the $5 tax." I lowered the paper, making direct eye contact with my father. His face was rapidly draining of its robust colour. The entire table laughed. I continued, my tone entirely devoid of anger. "You priced my worth to this family at exactly $50, and for 34 years, I accepted your terrible valuations. I accepted being the invisible foundation you built your egos upon." I placed the deed and the cruel note back onto the glass table, pushing them gently toward Dennis. "But I had the land surveyed," I stated cleanly, "and it turns out the dirt you threw away as a joke sits on a lithium reserve valued at $150 million. I sold the extraction rights through a blind trust. The transaction is complete, irrevocable, and entirely anonymous." I looked around the circle of stunned, wide-eyed relatives. "You decided I was worth $50. I'm simply holding you to your own contract." The room stopped breathing completely. The absolute silence that followed my revelation lasted for perhaps 5 seconds before the heavy, suffocating facade of family unity violently imploded. The sudden realization that their manipulative hospitality had completely failed triggered an instant, explosive regression to their true toxic nature. Patricia broke first. The performative tears vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly red flush that crept up her neck. "How dare you!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing harshly against the high ceilings. "After everything we have done to provide for you, you stand in our home and humiliate us. You are going to withhold generational wealth over a silly, harmless joke. You are a vindictive, ungrateful child." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply watched her expose her raw, transactional soul to the entire extended family. Kelsey slammed her wineglass onto the mantel, the liquid sloshing over the edge. "This is insane." "Maya," she yelled, her face contorted in a petulant rage. "You live in a tiny apartment. You don't even care about money. I need a house. Brandon's business is struggling. You are literally destroying this family because you are jealous of me." "I am not destroying anything," I replied softly, my voice a calm anchor in their raging storm. "I am simply refusing to fund your specific lifestyle." Dennis stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The illusion of the proud patriarch had completely disintegrated, revealing a man terrified of losing control. "You listen to me," Dennis snarled, pointing a trembling finger inches from my face. "You are not walking out of here with my money. I paid for that land. I hold the original title history. I will hire the most aggressive litigation firm in this state. I will tie that trust up in court for the next decade. I will bleed you completely dry with legal fees until you beg me to settle." Brandon moved to stand beside Dennis, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of intimidation. "He's right, Maya. You committed fraud by omission. You knew the value and you tricked him into signing it away. You cannot win this." I looked at the four of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, united solely by their desperate, insatiable greed. They were threatening me with financial ruin, emotional excommunication, and legal warfare. They expected me to crumble under the combined weight of their aggression, just as I had done when I was a vulnerable teenager. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating clarity. I did not need to raise my voice to defeat them. I only needed the absolute, undeniable truth. Their masks were finally gone. I remained perfectly still while Dennis continued to shout his empty legal threats. I did not cross my arms. I did not mirror his aggressive posture. I simply waited for his vocal stamina to deplete when his breathing finally became heavy and laboured. The room fell back into a dense, suffocating silence. I opened the second compartment of the thin manila folder. I pulled out the yellowed, handwritten letter that Aunt Evelyn had safeguarded for 8 years. The paper was fragile, creased at the edges, but the ink was bold and undeniable. It was Arthur's handwriting. I held it up, making sure Dennis could clearly see his own father's distinct script. "You are not going to hire a litigation firm," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried absolute authority, because any competent lawyer will demand to see the chain of evidence, and this letter is the definitive end of your fabricated narrative. I read Arthur's words to the silent room. I read the precise paragraph where Arthur explicitly detailed his knowledge of the mineral deposits. I read the sentences where Arthur accurately predicted that Dennis would view the land as a worthless tax burden. I read the final line where Arthur stated his deliberate intention to use Dennis's own superficial arrogance to safely transfer the true wealth to me. Dennis stared at the letter, his mouth slightly open. The colour did not return to his face. He looked physically diminished, as if the air had been violently pulled from his lungs. "He knew you, Dennis," I stated clinically. "He knew you would value a $5 tax saving over the dignity of your own daughter. He engineered this entire scenario. You were not tricked by me. You were outsmarted by the father you constantly ridiculed. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. Kelsey was staring at the floor. Brandon had subtly taken a step away from Dennis, his opportunistic instincts calculating the catastrophic loss of the asset. The power dynamic was completely and permanently shattered. They had no legal recourse. They had no moral high ground. They had absolutely nothing. I picked up the manila folder and tucked Arthur's letter safely inside. I left the $50 quitclaim deed and the mocking handwritten note sitting squarely on the glass coffee table, right above Brandon's useless investment portfolios. It was the only receipt they deserved. I looked at the four of them one last time. There was no love left to mourn. There was only the cold, sterile reality of their unmasked greed. I turned my back on the lavishly decorated living room. I walked across the polished marble foyer without rushing. I opened the heavy mahogany front door and stepped out into the crisp, cool Austin night. I did not look back at the illuminated mansion. The door clicked shut. It was precisely 48 hours after I walked out of the Christmas gathering. I was sitting at my kitchen island, organising my lesson plans for the upcoming spring semester, when a sharp knock echoed through my apartment. I opened the door to find a stoic process server holding a thick stack of legal documents. I signed for them calmly. Brandon had apparently found a lawyer desperate or foolish enough to file an emergency injunction. I sat at the table and reviewed the filing. The plaintiffs Dennis and Patricia were petitioning the county court to immediately freeze the assets of Luminescence LLC. The legal grounds were completely predictable. They alleged that Dennis had signed the quitclaim deed under duress, that he lacked sufficient mental capacity during the Thanksgiving dinner, and that I had committed egregious fraud by omission. Kelsey, simultaneously, had taken her grievances to the internet. She posted a tearful, heavily edited video on TikTok, vaguely describing a horrific family betrayal and painting herself as the victim of a greedy, manipulative older sister. The coordinated attack was designed to overwhelm my nervous system. I picked up my phone and dialed Vivian. When she answered, I read the core allegations of the injunction. She did not sound concerned. She sounded mildly irritated by the amateurish legal manoeuvring. She asked me if I had any concrete proof of Dennis's state of mind on that specific Thursday evening. I smiled. The irony was almost too perfect to articulate. I opened my laptop and navigated to a digital archive. Vivian, I said smoothly. During that dinner, my sister Kelsey was actively live streaming to her thousands of followers. She wanted to showcase her new Tesla deposit. She accidentally recorded the entire exchange regarding the deed. I had downloaded the video the very next morning, recognizing its potential utility. I emailed the encrypted file directly to Vivian's secure server. The footage was pristine. It showed Dennis laughing uproariously, holding a glass of scotch, completely lucid and entirely arrogant. The audio captured his voice perfectly. I am cutting all ties to this worthless dirt. Take it. Maya. It is entirely yours. No takebacks. There was no duress, there was no lack of mental capacity, there was only a man proudly and voluntarily abandoning an asset he deemed beneath his social status. Vivian reviewed the footage while I remained on the line. I heard her sharp, satisfied intake of breath. She immediately filed an emergency counter-motion, submitting the digital video as primary, undeniable evidence of voluntary intent. The judge reviewed the filing the following morning. The ruling was instantaneous. The injunction was aggressively denied with prejudice, and Dennis was severely reprimanded for filing a frivolous lawsuit based on easily disprovable perjury. Their expensive legal assault crumbled into dust before it even reached a courtroom. The injunction was dismissed. I received the final confirmation email from Vivian late on a Friday afternoon. The judge's dismissal of the injunction was absolute. Dennis and Patricia had exhausted their single, pathetic attempt at legal extortion. The firewall, protecting Luminescence LLC, remained completely unbreached. I sat on my sofa, the soft glow of the laptop screen illuminating the quiet room. Society places a massive, unreasonable burden on the concept of family. We are relentlessly conditioned to believe that bloodlines are sacred contracts, binding us permanently to the people who share our genetics. We are told to forgive the unforgivable, to turn the other cheek, to constantly seek reconciliation with individuals who only view us as a resource to be consumed. For 34 years, I had internalized that toxic ideology. I had carried the immense weight of their rejection, convinced that my worth was somehow tied to their eventual approval. But the events of the past 2 months had provided a brutal, necessary education. When Dennis filed that fraudulent lawsuit, attempting to ruin my life out of pure spite, the final, lingering thread of familial obligation snapped. Cutting ties with toxic relatives is rarely a singular, explosive event. It is usually a quiet, deliberate process of recognizing your own fundamental right to safety. I picked up my cell phone. I did not draft a dramatic farewell message. I did not seek closure or demand a final apology. Seeking closure from abusers is a futile exercise that only hands them another opportunity to manipulate your reality. I opened my contact list. I navigated to Dennis's profile. I pressed the block button. I felt a slight, almost imperceptible release of tension in my shoulders. I navigated to Patricia's profile. I pressed block. I did the same for Kelsey, and finally, for Brandon. I systematically went through every social media platform, email account, and digital communication channel, erecting an impenetrable digital wall. It was not an act of malice. It was an act of profound self-preservation. I was officially excising the tumour that had been draining my emotional vitality for decades. Aunt Evelyn had been right all along. I did not owe them my suffering. I did not owe them my wealth. I only owed myself the peace I had been denied since childhood. I set the phone down on the coffee table. The apartment was profoundly silent, but it was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of a survivor waiting for the next blow. It was the clean, expansive silence of absolute freedom. The invisible chains forged by Patricia and Dennis had dissolved into the Texas dust. I was finally entirely alone, and I had never felt safer in my entire life. I breathed freely again. Spring arrived in central Texas with a vibrant, sudden burst of colour. The bluebonnets bloomed aggressively along the highway medians, masking the dry earth beneath. It had been 4 months since the Christmas confrontation. The immense capital held within Luminescence, LLC, had rested quietly, generating substantial interest. It was finally time to execute the primary objectives. I drove to Aunt Evelyn's neighbourhood on a bright Tuesday afternoon. I parked down the street and watched from a distance. The postal worker dropped a certified envelope into her rusted mailbox. I waited until Evelyn stepped onto the porch to retrieve it. I watched through my windshield as she tore open the thick paper. It was a formal notification from her primary mortgage lender. The document explicitly stated that her outstanding home loan, along with all associated medical debt liens, had been satisfied in full by an anonymous philanthropic entity. She dropped her keys on the wooden porch. She pressed her hands to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with overwhelming relief. She would never have to fear losing her sanctuary again. I smiled, put the car in drive, and quietly left the neighbourhood. I would visit her later, entirely pretending I knew nothing about the miracle. The following morning, I arrived at the special education centre slightly earlier than usual. I was standing near the administrative office when Sarah, Leo's mother, was called in for an emergency meeting with the district superintendent. I lingered near the doorway, rearranging a stack of visual schedule cards. The superintendent handed Sarah a heavy, embossed folder. Luminescence LLC had formally established a comprehensive, specialised educational and medical trust, exclusively dedicated to Leo's lifelong care. Furthermore, a secondary, discreet grant had been routed through a local housing charity to completely clear Sarah's impending foreclosure. Through the narrow window of the office door, I saw Sarah collapse into the guest chair. She wept with a raw, visceral intensity that echoed down the quiet hallway. It was the sound of a mother realizing her child was permanently safe. I walked back to my classroom. Leo was sitting on his mat, meticulously sorting his wooden blocks. The heavy, dark circles of anxiety that usually mirrored his mother's exhaustion were gone. He looked up at me, offering a rare, fleeting moment of direct eye contact. I sat down beside him, handing him a blue block. The massive wealth hidden behind corporate lawyers and opaque trusts had finally touched the real world. It was actively repairing the damage caused by a ruthless, apathetic system. The wealth brought peace. At the conclusion of the academic year, I quietly submitted my resignation to the school district. I did not desire early retirement. I simply needed to elevate my operational scale. Over the next 18 months, Luminescence LLC funded the rapid construction of a state-of-the-art multidisciplinary special education academy in the Texas Hill Country. We built expansive sensory integration rooms, equine therapy stables, and comprehensive family support clinics. Aunt Evelyn accepted a position on the founding board of directors. I retained my role as an active instructor, spending my days exactly as I preferred, working directly with the students who needed me most. The facility operated entirely on the interest generated by the principal trust, ensuring its absolute financial permanence. While my world expanded into a beautiful, secure sanctuary, the universe efficiently closed the karmic loop on the people I had left behind. In a city like Austin, the rapid collapse of a pretentious facade is impossible to keep secret. News filtered through the social grapevine without me ever needing to ask. Brandon's aggressive real estate brokerage folded spectacularly. He had over-leveraged his firm on speculative commercial properties, relying heavily on the anticipated massive infusion of capital he believed he could extract from me. When the injunction failed and the funds never materialized, his creditors aggressively called in their debts. He filed for corporate bankruptcy before the summer ended. Kelsey's carefully curated online persona disintegrated shortly after. Without Patricia and Dennis's constant financial subsidies, she could not maintain the illusion of elite affluence. She was forced to quietly sell the white Tesla to cover massive, maxed-out credit card balances. Her social media accounts went entirely dormant. Dennis and Patricia faced the most poetic consequence of all. The high-profile litigation firm they had hired to file the fraudulent injunction did not work on contingency. They billed by the hour. The failed lawsuit, combined with the sudden loss of Brandon's perceived financial safety net, drained their liquid retirement accounts. They were forced to dramatically downsize, selling the illuminated suburban mansion to settle their mounting legal and tax obligations. They had spent their entire lives worshipping the superficial power of money. They had gleefully used a $50 piece of paper to demonstrate their absolute superiority over me. Now, they were drowning in the exact financial anxiety they had always mocked in others. I did not gloat. I did not monitor their specific miseries. I simply acknowledged the absolute mathematical fairness of their situation and continued to build my academy. Karma closed the loop. My new office at the academy overlooks a sprawling green courtyard where the students learn to cultivate small community gardens. The room is quiet, filled with natural light and the soft scent of cedar. Behind my desk, mounted securely on the wall, is a custom museum-grade display frame. It does not hold a university diploma or a prestigious civic award. It holds a simple, slightly wrinkled $50 quitclaim deed. Pinned carefully beneath the legal document is a small, yellowed note written in blocky, arrogant handwriting. Don't build a mansion, Remember the $5 tax?
I keep it there not as a trophy of petty vengeance, but as a profound, daily reminder of fundamental human nature. Money possesses no inherent moral alignment. It is merely a chemical reagent that strips away the polite, societal masks people wear. The immense wealth did not change my family. It simply exposed the terrifying depths of the greed that had always resided within their marrow.
When Patricia and Dennis laughed at that Thanksgiving table, they believed they were cementing my status at the absolute bottom of their hierarchy. They believed they possessed the ultimate authority to dictate my worth. They did not realise that their casual, arrogant cruelty was the exact mechanism that would guarantee my permanent, unassailable freedom. I look at the frame every single morning before the first school bell rings. It centres my focus. It reminds me why I built the academy, why I protected the trust with ruthless legal precision, and why I will never apologise for walking away from toxic bloodlines. The world will always attempt to hand you cheap, insulting valuations. It will always try to convince you that your quiet resilience is a sign of fundamental weakness. The greatest power you possess is the absolute refusal to internalise their flawed mathematics. True legacy is never defined by the assets you passively inherit from the people who failed to love you. True legacy is defined by the sanctuary you actively build for the people who genuinely need you. Those who price your worth with cheap jokes will eventually realise they couldn't afford you even if they tried. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply building a beautiful life they can never touch. Subscribe for the next one.